All right, welcome back to another episode of the Talk Talklux podcast. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna is here. Going to be a little bit shorter episode today, a follow-up to the last episode, which was all about the lawsuit, the very public lawsuit stemming from the "It Ends with Us" movie between Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and now expanding into the universe of Ryan Reynolds and all sorts of other things. So where are we on this?
So since our last episode, Justin Baldoni, I think it was the day that we published our episode, he filed a new lawsuit also in the federal court in the Southern District of New York, alleging all sorts of breach of contract type of claims against Blake Lively. I think Ryan Reynolds is in there as well. And ultimately, it's, I think, primarily a vehicle for him to tell his entire side of the story, to not only try to refute or give his side of the story of all of the allegations that she's making about potential sexual harassment that happened on the set of the movie, but also his side of the story with respect to this creative breakdown that happened in the post-production or post-filming of the movie.
This complaint is amazing. It's 180 pages, and the way a complaint is written, when you want to start a lawsuit, you have to file a complaint. The way you write it is that you lay out the facts, then you lay out the parties, and then you lay out the legal claims, typically in that order. This complaint, I was looking for the legal claims, and they didn't start until page 170. So there was 170 pages of facts with all kinds of, multimedia, photos, social media, all kinds of stuff. It's very interesting. Very interesting. Very, what I would describe as unconventional. And it seems like an effort by the Baldoni camp to use this process basically to tell its story. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, her complaint is much more straightforward. Her complaint is, it does have some breach of contract types of claims in there, but primarily it's an employment discrimination, retaliation complaint. And it's pretty straightforward. It's like, I complained, this is what you did to retaliate against me. His complaint is definitely more of a narrative of everything that happened. And I think mostly why I think we wanted to revisit this was because I think a lot of people feel that his side of the story, which has also been accompanied by airing a lot of text messages, and now yesterday, it's like always every day there's something new. A voicemail that he left her kind of apologizing for something. His attorney has apparently been on like the podcast morning show circuit. So they are definitely looking to get their side of the story out there. And from her perspective, what her attorneys have said is, this is just more of their campaign of retaliation to destroy her reputation. Now, in connection with her lawsuit, they're poisoning the jury pool. That's kind of a side note that we can get to later about a gag order that she and Ryan Reynolds have now requested in these lawsuits. But it's definitely an opportunity to get his story out there. And my vibe from social media is that it's working because people have definitely been on like a roller coaster following this whole story. At first, the public opinion definitely went against her during the press tour of having a hard time navigating in a thoughtful way questions about domestic violence. Then all this negative prior interviews that she had given came out. Then when she came back with her lawsuit and the accompanying New York Times article, it seemed like the pendulum kind of went back in her direction. Hey, maybe we all were duped by this nasty PR smear campaign. And now I think it is shifting back the other way, where people are skeptical now that her claims may have been misleading, that the New York Times article may have omitted a lot of relevant text messages. And I think my vibe from social media is that the public opinion is kind of swinging back in his favor. But I think some of the question here is like, what is that relevant to in the context of their lawsuits?
Yeah. Um, I think I think the end result of this is that no one wins. Um, this is like a classic, be careful what you wish for when you're filing these things, because living in a world where people's attention span is becoming shorter and shorter, you may be able to tell your whole story through a narrative of 170 pages of facts and a complaint, but I mean, who's going to pick up on that and who's going to read it? I feel like it's all going to get lost in the noise of this back and forth, and it seems to me that it's going to be very easy, for people to look at this and say, yeah, they're both wrong. Or ebbs and flows. Who did I last see on a morning show? That's who I'm going to side with. And I think going back to your question, staying on the legal piece of this is like, what about the jury pool and what is this? I mean, who knows if this case ever gets to a jury, but in theory, when you file a lawsuit, your idea is that you're going to get to a jury trial. So how is that going to play out? Then there's this other issue of what law is even going to apply. It's very interesting that this was brought in New York. It's a very interesting legal case, for a number of sort of like technical reasons.
Yeah, I mean, his complaint is in New York, but drops a footnote that the law of California applies and is saying that, in her lawsuit, she said California law applied. Um, so typically, I think California law is pretty favorable to employees. So I could understand from her perspective wanting to rely on California law. On the flip side, New York law is relatively protective as well. And I think the obviously judges in New York are going to be more well versed at applying the law of the state of New York. And even though it's a federal case, you're still applying the federal cases from the jurisdiction that you're in. You're not applying like a California interpretation of Title VII. You should be applying the Second Circuit's interpretation of Title VII. So that kind of stuff is a little bit convoluted. I don't know that it's going to make a big difference in the end. But just in terms of relevance, I think there's a couple points to keep in mind. Um, you know, this whole creative breakdown and this whole sort of idea that she stole this movie from him, what is that relevant to? In his lawsuit, it's relevant because his lawsuit is about those kinds of more contractual issues. With respect to her lawsuit, I think it becomes a little bit less relevant because her lawsuit is really, this is what happened from a potentially sexual harassment, sexually inappropriate conduct perspective. And then from what I could tell, the period is like November 2023 to January 2024 is when she complains about this formally. And I don't think there's any dispute that she made this complaint. Obviously, he's going to dispute how she characterized his behavior, but she definitely made a complaint of that I would consider to be protected activity, meaning protected from retaliation in January of 2024. The quote unquote retaliation of the PR campaign starts to happen in August of 2024. At that point, none of this dirty laundry about the creative process melting down is public. So that's not really relevant to her. Did they harm her reputation? Because I think part of what he's trying to get at is she's a horrible person. Look what she did to me. Look what her and her husband did to me. Look how they did this to me during the movie. They treated me horrible. And that's why her reputation is trash. But that's not what the timing really is, because nobody knew that at the time. Her reputation became trash at that time because of how she marketed the movie, which she says she was contractually obligated to do, and because these obscure interviews that she did here and there somehow gained like a ridiculous amount of traction. So ultimately, she's going to have to prove that these things are tied together. But I think it's important when you're kind of trying to figure out what the relevance of their different sides of the story is we really didn't know all that dirty laundry at the time. And that's the time period that her case is kind of focused on in terms of the damage to her reputation.
Yeah, but you wonder if I don't wonder. I suspect that part of the thought process in his with his folks in bringing this lawsuit and structuring it the way that they did was to basically unleash all of this and get it all out there and throw it all against the wall and see what sticks because it's yeah, I mean you can say that you can separate those two things and that her damages, I guess, or her defense to that the allegation that her reputation was already poor, is limited to that time and place. But if you're asking a jury to make assessments based on that, they're going to go with what they know. And what they know is a much more broad window than that small window of time that you're talking about. So I think from their perspective, they've probably been successful in muddying the waters and, controlling the narrative a little bit more. Is
Oh
that
yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's 100% their intention is to rehabilitate his reputation and continue, you know, she would say trying to destroy hers. Other people who are more, team Justin are going to say this is your own, fault, and people can decide, who they think was the bad guy in this situation. And obviously him refuting her allegations is relevant to her credibility. I mean, ultimately, when you're the plaintiff, you're going to have to prove all of your allegations. And he's, trying to demonstrate that if not outright lies and things are very misleading, certainly that can impact her credibility on issues that are relevant to her case, which is when it comes to the actual instances of sort of harassment. And just a little footnote to that is when you allege sexual harassment, it has a subjective component to it and an objective component to it. So, meaning that you yourself have to have been offended, and also that a reasonable person in your shoes would have been offended and took that as harassment. So, I think some of what he's arguing when it is more relevant to her claims is he's painting a totally different picture of a lot of these sexually charged situations that she alleged, and that is potentially going to be relevant to, you know did she reasonably perceive herself to be harassed, because we all know that, what is super offensive to one person could be literally nothing to another person. So there is a little bit of like a check in the law as to that. That being said, though, on her complaint and whether her complaint is protected from retaliation is a little bit different, because when you make a complaint of harassment, it doesn't have to be ultimately harassment within the meaning of the law. It has to be a good faith, reasonable belief that what they're doing violates the law. And then so she's got two different claims. Maybe her harassment claim doesn't survive, but maybe her retaliation claim does survive ultimately. So there's a couple different things going on, I think, in terms of some of his side of the story. I think is definitely relevant to what she's saying in her lawsuit. Some of it, I think, is definitely much more potentially just playing the long game, because ultimately, who knows how much money is even at stake in these lawsuits. Like, did she actually lose money? She's going to have to prove that. We don't know. He probably is playing the long game of my reputation is more valuable to me than if I end up having to pay her some money in her lawsuit, or vice versa.
yeah, again, I come back to like what we I always joke with when we turn away cases, I sort of suggest to people, I'm like, it's going to sound strange coming from someone who files lawsuits for a living, but I don't encourage people to jump into lawsuits, particularly employment lawsuits, unless they have to, um, because they are messy and they just drag things out and they can make something that would have been contained basically uncontained for a significant period of time. And I feel like for both of these people, I don't know how Hollywood works, but my suspicion is that it's going to be hard for either of them to move on from this in the short term. I mean, him in particular, and I guess that's why he did what he did. But I read some of the messages in the complaint. The guy's talking about how he's starting this new production company, and their focus is on like high-end topics that matter. And he's got all these like idealistic thoughts about the future of his business. And you got to think like most of that is tarnished. And even her, and now he's probably succeeded at showing the world, or to the extent that they didn't already know in Hollywood, that she's difficult to work with and controlling, and her and her husband are trying to run things over, and it just seems like this is a no-win situation. And I would imagine that their lawyers talked to them about this before they did it, but it's like we always say to clients, once you ring that bell, it can't be unrung. There's no going
Yeah,
back.
because regardless of how much we're advocates and how you want people to speak out and you want people to call out bad behavior, it's true. Everything will be tested in the context of a lawsuit. And when you're a public figure, it's either becomes public because the news picks up on it, or who your adversary is completely unpredictable. I mean, this guy has gone on like a media blitz against her to save his reputation. And I mean, maybe people feel like that's totally appropriate and totally within his rights, but like you cannot control who the other person's attorney is. The other person's attorney wants to be a celebrity in a situation like this. You have now opened like a can of worms that you cannot come back from. And I hate the language. And the thing I find for me that I really don't like about his complaint, even though I think it's as they break it down, I think it gives a compelling other side of the story, or his side of the story, whether it goes in his favor or not. One thing I really don't like the way they worded it was that like she's going to regret, it literally says in there like she is going to regret this. That I don't like. That sits very poorly with me. That being said, I think it does go back to what you said, is that getting involved in this process, you need to put a lot of thought into 50 steps down the line. If this blows up in the worst possible way, what can happen? And what can happen is like, my husband is a witness, my husband is a defendant, my husband has to come in and talk about this, like everybody involved in the movie has to come back in and talk about this. Are these people going to be on my side? I have called lots of potential witnesses sometimes, and you really have to, like, you're not sure. A lot of people don't want to get involved. They're not going to come and back you up if you need them sometimes. So I think this definitely could end up being something that she regrets. I hate to say that because I'm in favor of people coming out and trying to right, a wrong. And if they did go on this smear campaign against her and that's true, and she's able to ultimately prove it, and they did it because she made this complaint, that's like another key thing. Why did they do it? Then it makes me sad that that someone would be deterred, I guess, from holding someone accountable for that. But this is definitely an example of how things can quickly turn against you. And we have definitely had that conversation with clients, and I have had that conversation with people that I have told them flat out, I might not be a good fit for you, because they wanted to go to the media. And obviously, at least at this point in our careers, we're not representing celebrities, but everybody lives in a location where your case might appear on the front page of whatever local newspaper there is. And there have been people who wanted to do that. And my thing is like, not only is that not necessarily our style, or do we think that's effective in getting you the appropriate legal outcome in the context of your lawsuit, which is what we do, but I think this is a good example of like not drinking your own Kool-Aid. Maybe this will all go in her favor and we're just going to keep going back and forth and back and forth. Like, Justin is bad, she's bad there, or she's great, she did the right thing, he whatever. But you do have to be cautious about not drinking your own Kool-Aid, because this is a very good example of showing that people might not be on your team. They are not going to necessarily be on your side, or think that this horrible thing that you feel that happened to you is really horrible. And I
Yeah,
think you have to
I,
be cautious about that. And that can be hard conversation for, an attorney to have. You can say, look, I believe in your case from a legal perspective. I don't know that it's going to help you to try to go on a media tour about your case.
Yeah, we've had, several cases over the years in the media. In all of those cases, it's been because the media thought it was an important story, they picked it up and they came to us. And in those situations, I think for the most part it was ultimately for the benefit of the case. But we see routinely, we see cases in the media that we know for a fact these cases came through our office. We turned them away because we didn't think that there was merit. And now the cases are all over the media. And in many, I shouldn't say many, but it's not uncommon that in the end, those cases go nowhere. And, the lawyer gets their name in the media, but now I don't know that there's a benefit for the client. And the client is, their face has been splashed across the media. Now when they go for a job and somebody does a search, that pops up, and, like it or not, employers are considering that. It goes to the comment that we both made, which is, if you're going to do these things, you really have to think several steps down the road. You can't just react emotionally. And I think our job as attorneys is to pull people back from those emotional decisions and help them think about the long-term implications of these kinds of things. So, we'll see how it goes. I think, I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk. That, anything else before we wrap?
No, I think we covered most of it. The only thing we didn't talk about with Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds was the gag order.
Okay,
They have
give a
requested
you want to give a 1 minute
a gag
summary of
order.
the gag order?
Yeah, I will just say one brief thing about that. I think the obviously I would say probably the most legal reason to do something like that is because they are so public that it could potentially influence a jury in their cases. I don't think it's super common to have a gag order. I think, the courts in general are err on the side of being public. So typically you don't see cases being sealed. You don't necessarily see something like that. But and I think one of the things that they did mention was that yes, Baldoni's attorney is allowed to be an advocate, but you have to do that within the bounds of, your ethical obligations and kind of going out there on podcasts and airing all of stuff that these things that should be evidence. Now that you do have pending lawsuits is not really appropriate. So I don't know if this gag order has actually been, if that was successful or not. But I definitely think it shows that Baldoni and his attorney have certainly tried to, I think, get ahead of that, because it's pretty common in lawsuits that you would have maybe a protective order, a confidentiality order in place where the documents that you exchange in discovery, you keep at least certain categories of those types of documents private. So I think they're trying to get ahead of that by putting this all into the universe before a judge tells them that they can't. And that I'm sure certainly is their intention in terms of, from their perspective, they would frame it as he's saving his reputation. From her perspective, they think that this is just continued retaliation.
Be careful what you wish for. That's the theme of life. All right. Okay. So thanks for listening. We will be back again in a week or two, talking about whatever is hot in the news. If you have questions, reach out to us. Easiest way is on social media, Instagram at TalkLex Podcast. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Follow the show, like, subscribe, leave us a review, do all those things. And if you have questions about legal issues, visit our website, DurazioPeterson.com, or we are on all the socials as well. So thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.